As we were waiting just a couple minutes ago, my wife reminded me that she needs to get me an optometrist appointment. And the last time I was in the optometrist's office, it must have been just about a year ago, I guess, there was a young couple. Sitting who were waiting in the office, and I could tell they were married because they were wearing matching T-shirts. It's only, very young, freshly married couples who will wear the same clothing. So I kind of figured that out. But I started reading the T-shirt, and on the front of the T-shirt it had a picture of a globe that was on fire, the world. And the caption above it or below it, I don't recall which, said, "This world will burn. Get out of it and into Jesus." And then one of them turned around, and there was the King James Version printed out of 2 Peter 3, verses 10 through 13. Now, that text, 2 Peter 3, is a primary passage that's used to support the idea that the material universe will be obliterated in a cosmic judgment upon the return of the Lord. In verses 10 through 13, Peter uses a string of very vivid terms to indicate a violent upheaval that will bring this present world to an end and will usher in the new heavens and the new earth. And I printed out that text on your paper so you can follow along with me. "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and all the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to this promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth, in which righteousness dwells." Now, at first glance, Peter seems to say that this present universe will be destroyed in the apocalyptic fires of judgment. For centuries, preachers and Bible teachers have turned to this text and drawn from it a divine promise of an apocalyptic undoing of the universe, a total annihilation of planet Earth upon the return of the Lord. Actually, the rendering, I've given you the ESV version, but the rendering of the King James Version for verse 10 has kind of set the tone for the way that most Christians read it. "The heavens shall pass away, and pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up." It's easy to see how whole generations of Christians have learned from their Bibles to expect a future judgment by fire, which will annihilate the universe. This world, this universe that we live in, then, has an end date stamped upon it, a termination point. God's final word relative to the material creation is a decided no, a thunderous and decisive no. But God has said yes to his people through his gracious redemption in Jesus Christ. Under the expectation of a destruction of the material universe, the future of the redeemed, then, must lie elsewhere. We'll be taken out, rescued from the burning, raptured. God's gracious redemptive purpose and his original creative purpose don't overlap. Redemption, then, entails the negation of creation. Thus we speak of the end of the world. But we, those who have placed their faith in Jesus, have the promise of eternal life. Sound biblical scholarship, however, suggests that such interpretations of 2 Peter 3 are more Gnostic or dualistic than they're Christian in origin. And biblical scholars argue this way today because older, more reliable manuscripts than those that have given us the King James reading, especially of verse 10, say that rather than being burned up, this world will be laid bare, be found, made manifest, or exposed. Those are just terms that appear in more recent translations at the end of verse 10. The manuscript tradition on which the King James is dependent says that this world will be consumed or burned. Today, however, virtually all commentators on this passage agree that the proper verb at the end of verse 10 is not to burn, but rather to find or to discover. And I'll spare you the Greek terms here. But the same verb that's used at the end of verse 10 is found, when I say it's to be found, is also found in 2 Peter 3, in 1 Peter 1:7, where it calls up the image of a judgment by refiner's fire. Listen to 1 Peter 1:7. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found, there it is, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor to the revelation of Jesus Christ. Fact is, much of the language of 2 Peter 3 comes from the realm of metallurgy and has to do with the smelting or refining of metals. The verb in verse 10 can thus be rendered, be discovered, be exposed. The idea here is the removal of the corrupting impurities, the siphoning off of the dross that comes on top, so that the pure metal underneath can be revealed, laid bare, found. Following this lead, 2 Peter 3 does not teach an annihilation of the material universe, but rather a purification or a cleansing of the world upon the Lord's return. Arguing for 2 Peter 3 as purification rather than annihilation, Gail Hyde, in his essay, finds a parallel in the biblical depiction of the resurrection. He says this: God will transform the existing creation. He will right all the wrongs that have taken place on the existing earth. The world on which we now live will continue to exist in a transformed state after God releases it from the bonds of corruption. God will transform the world in much the same fashion that He transformed the resurrection body of Jesus, and will transform our bodies. End quote. Fact is, purification language, the language of smelting, is not uncommon at all in biblical texts depicting the coming day of the Lord. For example, in Malachi chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, we read this: But who can endure the day of His coming? Who can stand when He appears? For He is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and He will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver. And they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Interesting, but usually ignored, is Paul's depiction of the day of judgment in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 12 through 15. It provides a striking parallel here as it intentionally employs the imagery of metal smelting for the purposes of purification and testing. Listen to what Paul says. Now, if any man builds on the foundation of gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed with fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. So you'll see what I'm arguing for here. Not the annihilation of creation, but rather the restoration, the purification of creation. Now, to be sure, the judgment that's depicted in texts like 2 Peter 3 does represent a radical overturning of our present world. An overturning that is often couched in what we would call cosmic judgment language. Such prophecies in the Old Testament as the earth being shaken, the stars falling, the sun and moon being darkened, these were typical of the prophets, not just for the ultimate future, but also for impending political catastrophes, whether for Israel or her enemies. Isaiah, for example, describes the judgment that will soon fall upon Babylon in this language. This is from chapter 13, verse 10. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light, and the sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Now, that's not talking about the end of the world. That's talking about the fall of Babylon. But it's very common to get that kind of cosmic language for political catastrophe. This cosmic judgment language is meant to emphasize the world-shaking events that are about to transpire. In the case of 2 Peter 3, the point is that the return of the Lord will not be a simple cleanup job, a picking up of the trash, a throwing of the bums out of office, a making sure the right team wins the World Series. It will be a purgation, a radical cleansing of creation from sin and death. Thus, the first two clauses, the heavens will pass away with a roar. The heavenly bodies will be dissolved in the heat, certainly do envision a radical cataclysm. The world as we presently know it is headed for judgment. The world to come will be radically different in any number of ways. Yet it's nevertheless the case that the passage simply does not teach that the coming judgment will eradicate, will annihilate God's creation. Nor will it bring in an utterly new world, a replacement creation. Rather, the consummation of the kingdom will be a cleansing, a rehabilitation of God's first creation. Now, this interpretation is actually supported by the larger context. Verses 10 through 13, which we read, is simply part of what Peter is saying. If we go back and start reading from about verse 3, we find out that Peter is talking about three worlds here. He's talking about the world before the flood, those people who lived at the time of Noah. We see that in verse 6. Then in verse 7, he begins talking about the present world, the world that exists between the flood and the day of the Lord. That is the world that we live in. And then in verse 13, he talks explicitly of the new heavens and new earth, the world that will exist after the coming of the Lord. Now, these three worlds are not categorically three different worlds, as Mars is different from Venus, and the two of them are different from Mercury. It will be one and the same world, but in three different periods of history. Further, these worlds are marked off. They're delineated from one another by two cosmic crises: judgment by the flood and judgment by the future day of the Lord. This structure sets up an explicit parallel then between the judgment of the flood and the future judgment by fire. Hence, that suggests that the upheaval that is to come is like unto the Noahic flood. You catch that? Like unto. See the analogy. This is like that. The past is an analogy for the future. And that's the key to the whole passage. God's promised judgment upon the world must be understood through the analogy of the Noahic flood in Genesis 6 and following. This world will be destroyed, as Noah's world was deluged with water and perished. That's the way Peter puts it in verse 6. Yet the creation Noah inhabited was not literally destroyed. God has created his universe only once, and it's still here. He didn't create an alternative universe. Noah's world was destroyed insofar as it was cleansed. It was purified of its corruption. God's creation survived the flood as a purified world, redeemed from the corruption that had pervaded it. What was destroyed in the flood was not planet Earth, but the world of human wickedness and sin. In like manner, the future fire of judgment in 2 Peter 3 should be envisioned not as something that demolishes the current creation, but as a refiner's fire that burns up the impurities, so that the purity of God's original creation can once again be exposed, revealed. Peter's ethical application, which comes in verses 11 through 13, the message he wants to really make in the text is that since the coming judgment will purge the world of sin and its effects, the people of God are to strive to live such good lives that when we and the works of our hands pass through the refiner's fire, both will survive. Rather than incite despair about the world, rather than incite a dismissal of the material universe, Peter's admonition actually inspires hope that our efforts on behalf of God's kingdom in this world right now will survive into the new heavens and the new earth. Peter is not saying this world's headed for judgment, therefore it doesn't matter. He's saying God loves this world, and therefore what we do in it matters very much. Peter encourages his readers to live lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming day of the Lord. Similar admonitions can be found in Paul whenever he talks about the future. For example, he ends his long discussion about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 by saying this: "Therefore, my brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." Again, anything but a running away from the world. Likewise, 2 Corinthians 5:10. Again, a resurrection passage. Paul reminds his readers that God's judgment is sure, and that what we do presently in the world, in the body, as he puts it, matters into the world to come. Both Peter and Paul are telling us that God's promised future bears present consequences for our lives. God is going to redeem all things. That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:31 can say, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God." The point is really twofold here for Peter. One, all our work now contributes to the content of the new creation. And second, all our behavior must now be judged by the standards of that new creation. Well, while we're thinking about Noah's flood in the New Testament, we should also mention Matthew 24. This is the other significant passage. So let us turn our attention there. And the flood story from Genesis 6 and 7 plays a very similar role. It's, again, an analog for future judgment. And this comes in the context of Jesus' declaration of the signs of the end of the age. And this is Matthew 24, verses 37 through 41. And again, you see the text there. "As it was in the days of Noah," see how it begins? "As it was in the day of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at a mill. One will be taken and one left." Now, this text is often cited as a proof text for what has come to be called the rapture. which was popularized in the Scofield Reference Bible early in the 20th century. The idea refers to the idea that when the Lord returns, the redeemed will be caught up in the air and taken out of the world. In that event, the church is fitted for a heavenly existence and takes up residence with Jesus in heaven. Now, we've all, I think, been if you're an American, you've been exposed to this idea somewhere, somehow, sometime, even if you've never gone to church. You've been exposed to it in movies, in literature, probably in a commercial somewhere. But reading Matthew 24 as teaching a rapture of the church from the world, if we read it that way, Jesus is saying that, two men are working in the field. One will be taken to be with the Lord, and the other will be left. Of the two women, one will be taken, one will be saved to be with the Lord in heaven, and the other will be left to judgment, will be left behind. How many of you all have heard of the Left Behind series of books? There's an example of this very idea, okay? The problem here is that the text simply does not say that the ones taken are to experience God's deliverance. Actually, interpreting the text as a rescue from earthly corruption imposes a reading upon the text that is quite the reverse of the obvious or natural reading. The analogy of the flood strongly suggests that to be taken is to experience wrath, and to be left is to know God's grace. Matthew 24 speaks of the general conditions immediately prior to the flood. People were carrying on their lives, conducting their affairs in total ignorance of the coming judgment, right up until the flood came and swept them all away. The natural reading is that those who are taken are not Noah and his family, but rather the ungodly. And they're taken not to redemption, but to judgment. Now, this might sound counterintuitive to those of us who are used to thinking of this text in terms of a rapture, but it's actually easily proven. The pronouns they, as in they knew nothing, and them took them all away, being plural, must refer to a plural noun. The only plural noun here is people. That is, the unregenerate. Noah is a singular noun throughout the text. He's not taken. He's left behind. Ben Merkel, who's a theologian at Southeastern Baptist Seminary, has recently and quite convincingly argued that the being taken and being left talk that we see in Matthew 24 is actually exile language from the Old Testament prophets. Using a number of prophetic texts, he demonstrates pretty conclusively that to be left behind is to be included in the righteous remnant. And to be taken is to be judged through death or deportation into exile. Quite the reverse of the popular rapture idea. Merkel even notes that in terms of the Noah story in Genesis 7, verse 23, it explicitly tells us that God blotted out the unrighteous, but Noah was left behind. We get the same thing, the same story if we turn to the parable of the weeds of Jesus in Matthew 13. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to look at every possible text. Well, what's my conclusion here? That neither 2 Peter 3 nor Matthew 24 supports an eschatological marginalization of the world. That God is saving his people and the world is going to be destroyed. Just the reverse. I wouldn't want to say that quite that way. The analogy of the flood calls up the promise of God's everlasting covenant of life, spoken of in the Noahic covenant of Genesis chapter 9. And here's why I want to turn there now. Unfortunately, Genesis 9 and its depiction of the Noahic covenant is often just plain ignored by Bible-believing Christians, and I quite simply don't know why. And not just ignored by the pulpit and the pew, it's often ignored by theologians as well. Even though the word covenant appears repeatedly throughout the text. By the way, the word covenant first appears in relationship to Noah in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 6, when God promises to make a covenant, a relationship with Noah. Even though that's the case, it's not uncommon to find Christian authors beginning, even telling the story of the covenant with Abraham in chapter 12. Okay, I get it. The story of God's electing a people begins with Abraham. So it's relevant to us in our salvation. But you know what? Not everything revolves around us and our salvation. God's covenant concern is larger, more all-encompassing than the story of personal, individual salvation. As rightly important as the salvation of human beings is, both to us and the biblical story, it's not the beginning of the story, and it's not all there is. God is writing a larger story. And He's writing us into it as part of it. But we're not the entirety of it. Before God calls Abraham, before He focuses the narrative on the redemption of human beings as the subjects and mediators of His redemptive purpose, He puts the calling of Abraham into perspective by reminding us that He's not just the Redeemer God. He's the God who created all things in the first place. And His redemptive concern and love stands over all His works. We usually think of Noah and the flood story as an act of covenant curse, and it is. But it's also a crucial element in the redemptive story that the Bible tells. The ark was a medium of deliverance for Noah, his family, the animals, and the flood, the washing away of the unrighteous through the waters of judgment, the removing of sinners and their cultures was a redemptive act. And it wonderfully gives us a picture of God's ultimate redemptive agenda. It is what? The removal of sin and death. That's what redemption is. John tells us in 1 John chapter 3, the reason the Son of Man came into the world was to destroy the devil and his works. Redemption is about taking away sin and its effects. But further, listen to the string of covenant declarations that God makes to Noah in Genesis 9. Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. It is for every beast of the earth. Verses 9 and 10. This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all generations. Verse 12. The covenant between me and the earth. Verse 13. I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. Verse 15. We should have gotten the message, but it continues. I will remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Verse 16. The covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that's on the earth. Verse 17. I'm tempted to ask at this point, what is it about the word everlasting that we just don't get? Genesis 9, and it's unqualified and repeated over and over again so that we never miss it, affirmation of the value of creation should inform how we read 2 Peter 3 and Matthew 24. God has an everlasting covenant with the earth and its creatures. He created the world in the first place, and He loves it dearly. Whatever's going on in 2 Peter 3 and Matthew 24, it is most assuredly not about the destruction of the earth, as God has promised His unending love for all the things He's made. The eternality of the covenant is declared twice in the text, as it is for all generations, verse 12, and everlasting, verse 16. It's not too much to say that the later references to the Noah flood as an image of judgment are telling us how to read God's promised future judgment in light of, they're telling us to read God's future judgment in light of the Noah story. That's what I'm trying to say. That the Noah story itself is the interpretive clue for how to read the later texts. And the takeaway of the Noah story is not destruction, but rather grace in the midst of judgment. God's grace. Not just humanity, but to creation as well. The narrative of Noah, flood, and covenant tell us that the biblical story loses nothing of its totalizing proportions and intention. God is the creator of all things in Genesis 1 and 2. He never loses that concern. Coming as it does before the story of the patriarchs, the Noahic story warns us not to limit God's redemptive concern to an agenda that somehow saves people but destroys the very world they were created for. As the Noah story reaffirms the calling of human beings as God's image bearers within and toward the created world, we're set up for the calling of Abraham as being a redemptive mission which has the whole world in view as well. Now, perhaps we're embarrassed. Frankly, I think we're embarrassed by Noah. It's reminding us of our callings as human beings to functions as mediators of divine blessing to the world. It's reminding us of the role that Noah was expressly called to. By constructing a boat that was much larger than was necessary for the deliverance of himself and just his family. Perhaps we're embarrassed by the implication that human beings and the rest of the created order exist together in a single organic reality, in covenant relationship, not just with God, but with one another and with the earth itself. Perhaps that's why we ignore Noah. This story subverts our assumptions about human beings. We assume that we're simply tourists in the earth, that we're beings whose homeland is properly elsewhere. We assume that we have no investment in the goings-on of this material universe. Noah subverts all of those. Let us not miss the intended payouts of the Noahic covenant. God has reasserted his own status as Lord over creation. And in doing so, he affirms and protects his world. The story reaffirms his covenant concern and his will. And in doing that, it gives us an invaluable insight into the character of our Redeemer. He is jealous. He gives nothing up. He commits himself anew to his creation, in spite of the fallenness of his human covenant partner. He is a faithful God, staying sure to his blessing, even through judgment, all the way to the coming of the New Jerusalem to earth and making all things new. Well, if God's big story is headed towards, John Calvin called it the resurrection of creation. Calvin had no problem whatsoever applying the language of resurrection to creation, especially when he thought about a text like Romans 8, where Paul talks about creation itself groaning, looking forward to the liberation of the sons of God. And if God's big story is headed towards the future resurrection of all of creation, a purgation of sin and death and their effects from every nook and every cranny of God's world, what does that mean for how we are to live right now? We are to be resurrection people, ruling and caring, embodying and working, dancing and bearing the blessed hope of a God who has big plans, who dreams big dreams. We are to be, as Peter tells us, waiting for and hastening the coming day of the Lord by being agents of a vision for the world in which the gospel blesses all things. One day, Martin Luther was planting a pear tree in his yard. And a parishioner walking by thinking that the minister could obviously spend his time better than on such mundane activities, chided Luther. He said, "Dr. Luther, what would you be doing today if you knew that Christ were returning tomorrow morning?" To which Luther replied that he would continue planting pear trees. For if the Lord did return in the morning, the pears would taste especially sweet tomorrow evening. Thank you.